Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Swainson, and on behalf of the Litfest Board of Trustees, I'd like to welcome you to the 42nd Lancaster Literature Festival. As many of you know, after a successful opening weekend, Litfest 2020 had to be cancelled due to COVID-19. So for this year's festival, our volunteer board realized it had to work in a different way and decided to create a diverse and inclusive festival to be delivered entirely free and entirely online. With support from Lancaster City Council and Arts Council England project grant, and support also from our sponsors and partners, our aim, as we near the end of this long winter lockdown, has been to bring ashore a rich cargo of fiction, poetry, illustration, and ideas, plus all kinds of activities and challenges in the form of a free online festival. Now, as a registered charity with no regular Arts Council funding, if we are to be able to go on creating exciting projects and events, bringing the best in world literature and ideas to the northwest of England and to our international audiences too, we're going to need your help. So during the Q&A, a donate button will appear on your screen, but depending on your connectivity, you may prefer to visit our website once the event is over at www.litfest.org. Every gift will help us to build towards that future where we can all actually meet again. But for now, though we're physically distanced, we are happily socially together. The Litfest International Fiction Book Club was due to be launched at Litfest 2020 with a visit from Lars Mitting, the Norwegian novelist. But for reasons we know all too well, this had to be transferred online. But we did start the book club in April last year, and it's been going ever since. So Lars Mitting's The 16 Trees of the Somme was the first of the 11 books we have discussed up till now. And at each occasion, we've been able to welcome the author, the translator, the editor, or a prize judge to join our discussion. And these have included Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead, which we discussed with the translator Antonia Lloyd-Jones, Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, with Booker International judge Lucy Campos, Robert Zeythaler's A Whole Life with the translator Charlotte Collins, Jan Lianka's The Four Books with translator Carlos Rojas, and most recently, Till, with its author Daniel Kaelman. Grey Bees will be the 12th book we have discussed, and tonight we are delighted to welcome its author, Andrey Kurkov, and to discuss the books, and to discuss the book club's convener, Sam O'Donoghue of Lancaster University, and two of our book club members, Lisa Keys and Kane Moore. Now, normally, we would all discuss the book amongst ourselves on Zoom until our guest arrived at 7:15. But as this is a Litfest event and we're recording for our YouTube channel, we're going to play a game of double jeopardy. Our brave author will hear the candid opinions of our members, and the four of us standing in for a group that is usually anything from a dozen to 16, the four of us will then have to brave Andrey Kurkov's comments on our readings of his novel. At just after 7, we'll put our questions to Andrey, followed by those that come over in the chat, and he will answer them until we've run out of questions or we've run out of time at about 7:45. And now let me introduce our honored guest. Andrey Kurkov is as I'm sure almost everybody here will know, is a Ukrainian author who writes in Russian. Before the success of Death and the Penguin, which appeared in English in 2001, he was variously a journalist, prison warder, cameraman, and screenplay writer. And in his spare time, which I hope he'll tell us about in a bit more detail, published his fiction extremely successfully, it has to be said, as a self-publisher, amassing sales of up to 70,000 copies of his books. Since the early 2000s, he has also become well known as a commentator on Ukraine for the international media. His many books include The Ukraine Diaries and The Bickford Fuse. Grey Bees has been described in the UK press. It came out last November, I think. 3 little quotes will give you a flavour of what we're about to hear. In spare prose, said the Financial Times reviewer, Ukraine's most famous novelist unsparingly examines the inhuman confusions of our modern times and the longing of the warm-hearted everyman, that is Sergeyevich, for the rationality of the natural world. New European called it a warm and surprisingly funny book from Ukraine's greatest living novelist. And the TLS had praise for the translation, translated by Boris Dralyuk with sensitivity and ingenuity, the reviewer said. Well, now we're going to see what Litfest International Fiction Book Club members made of it, and I'm going to hand over to Sam O'Donoghue to conduct that discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for your introduction, and thank you to our live audience for being here, and thanks, of course, to our book club members, Lisa and Kane, and of course Bill himself, and we'll be discussing this novel now. I mean, perhaps should we just begin with a discussion of our initial thoughts of this book? I don't know if we have a volunteer to start. It's always hard being the first person, isn't it?
I'll go for it then.
Thanks, Lisa.
Best to get it out of the way. Yeah, so I'd never read any Kurkov before, so this was my first sitting. I really enjoyed the first, maybe the first third, or I can't remember how many pages it was, but the bit where we're immersed in his everyday life in the grey zone, the slow pace, the really kind of everyday experience, what he ate, what he was thinking, the kind of real slow pace. I really enjoyed that, and as it went on, I was, I absolutely enjoyed it, but found it all got quite hectic, and I found myself really understanding the character that I was reading about and his ultimate kind of need to get back to where he was coming from, and that kind of desire for the slower pace of things. Got lots of other comments, but generally speaking, I think that's kind of how my mood went through the book, is that first bit was very slow and I really enjoyed it, and as it got more hectic, yeah, I understood where he was coming from.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make, Lisa. So that change in pace, we have that really slow beginning, slow first part of it, and it does change pace, doesn't it? I mean, I think that pace might almost reflect the development of the character. I think the character changes over the course of the novel as well, doesn't it? Maybe that pick up in the tempo of the novel is perhaps a reflection of when the character begins to develop on his travels. Kane, what do you think?
I'm coming from a really different perspective, because I first read, I think it was when the second Penguin novel was released. I sort of went through a massive Kurkov phase for a couple of years and just really loved reading all those books. So it was really great, actually, after probably about 15 years pause, to return to his books. I hated the novel. No, I'm joking. I really liked the novel. I don't think I had the same issue in terms of the change of pace, because I mean, there is the immersion, as you say, in the first third of the book in the grey zone, but I think there is a sort of similar application of this, the sort of living within a kind of very quiet chaos that sits and runs through everything, and runs through particularly that sort of the experience in the kind of final third in the Crimea, of just this sense of oppression that hangs over what is effectively quite almost like a sort of everyman character, and just, you live within this sort of constant sense of threat, which is really realized right at the start of the novel with the bombs going ahead, but that I think still sits there, and it's probably, there's the image of the grenade right towards the end of the novel within the beehive, that there is always this constant sense of oppression by the state, by other people, and I sort of really enjoyed. My partner's Polish, and my former flatmate is Ukrainian, so it's really interesting, sort of understanding, having understood a bit more about the history of Ukraine in the past few years, and also sort of seeing it alongside. I've sort of dived into quite a lot of sort of Polish cinema recently, and recently watched a film called Mish, I think I'm pronouncing it right, which translates as teddy bear, which sort of has a similar absurdity behind it, kind of toxic absurdity.
Thanks, Kane. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think even amid that slow pace of the start of the novel, there is so much going on. I mean, we have these this faint awareness, don't we, of all this noise, but of course the protagonist of the novel himself lives in this world of silence, this silence that blocks out the noise of the bombs, the shells going off, the gunfire, which is, so I guess there's that feeling of something constantly going on, but we're occupying Sergeyevich's interior world, aren't we? Bill, how about you?
Well, I enjoyed this book enormously. And one of the things that made it really enjoyable was the way in which Kurkov uses tiny details to either make a point or move the story along. And I was just looking now, a few minutes ago, at a passage where a man called Petro, who's with the Ukrainian army, comes to his door, and it turns out they have beekeeping in common. But there's a discussion inevitably about names. And I'd quite like to read a little passage, because it shows you how cleverly Andrey Kurkov makes this work. So this man has come to the door, and Sergeyich is expecting his frenemy from the other street in their tiny village. They're opening the door, expecting to see one person. He finds himself confronted with a soldier with a gun in uniform, in camouflage. But eventually they negotiate that he can come into the house, and Sergeyich says, "What's your name?" "Petro." "And where are you from?" "From Khmelnytskaya," if that's the right pronunciation. "Ah," Sergeyich said, sounding as if he had grasped something important. "Ukrainian army, then?" The young man nodded. "Artillery." Petro shook his head. "And what's your name?" "Me? Sergey Sergeyich." "You can call me Sergeyich. So it's probably Peter, not Petro." "No, it's Petro. Says so in my passport." "Well, my passport says I'm Serhiy Serhiyevich, but I say I'm Sergey Sergeyevich. That's the difference." "You probably don't agree with your passport," Petro said. "No, I agree with my passport, just not with what it chooses to call me." "Well," says Petro, "I agree both with my passport and what it chooses to call me," the guest said with a smile. It was an easy smile, even disarming, although a rifle hung on the back of his chair. And it just struck me that in that passage, you've got a very clear demonstration of the way that Andrey Kurkov uses small and tiny differences to get across something monumental, because this is really just another version of the Bible story of the shibboleth. You pronounce a word one way, or you pronounce it another word, and you're in trouble. But it's all done with this very gentle but sparklingly clear and intelligent sense of humor, and that develops through the book, and the pace does become speedier. But this sense of small life at one level, and the bees, which Sergeyich is hugely concerned with, but the bees also play a role for. They have a role in this in the story. They have their role as being the focus of Sergeyich's attentions and affection, but they also have a role in a kind of a fable. And of course, as we'll discover, when they change color, it's for a purpose. So I loved it, and I loved the way it worked.
Thank you, Bill. There is, isn't there? There's that discussion of you've just quoted the passage in which there's a discussion of people's names, and of course there is also this meditation on place names running throughout the text and what they mean, and almost this sense of geographical coincidence as well. That people are both bound to a certain place, but they also can change places, and how a place affects people and they become part of it, but also they can move around as well. So I thought there was a wonderful meditation on homelessness, this sense of homelessness of Sergeyevich as both part of this location, but also potentially homeless in the world as well. It's the one thing that keeps him to his former life, continuing to live in this war-torn zone, this grey zone. But at the same time, he's able to escape for some time and then return and feel that belonging again. The book actually reminded me a bit, and my fellow book club members may have some views on this as well, of Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. So a book that we read roughly a year ago now, I think, didn't we, Bill?
Yeah,
now that could just be the general ambience, I think, this recreation of cold landscapes. Now, I don't tend to read many books that recreate cold landscapes. I'm actually a lecturer in Spanish, so much of what I read recreates warm landscapes rather than cold ones. So I found that, but I also find the kind of idiosyncratic characters as well. These very particular types, Pashka, for instance, Sergeyevich himself, they struck me as the same kinds of characters that populate that novel by Tokarczuk. Yes, and also the discussion of loneliness, isolation, that feeling of a very hermetic world that's also quite connected with the landscapes as well. Okay, I think then if we just formulate some questions for our guest when he arrives. So perhaps should we just go around again, and Lisa, I mean, have you got any thoughts on any questions you might like to ask?
Oh my gosh, hundreds of questions. But I guess one of my overriding thoughts was whether or not culturally beekeeping is something that is a commonality to the people of this area. I mean, I don't know, but when the main character was going around to these different places, he needed a piece of equipment or needed some help, and inevitably he would find or be able to locate another beekeeper or somebody who had a piece of equipment that could help him out. And so I don't know anything about this area at all, but is this either is it something that is culturally something that is done, or is it used as a device to help us understand that there are commonalities between these very different places that speak different languages or have different cultures? So is that kind of beekeeping? I'm just wondering if, is that something that happens a lot?
Perhaps the importance of beekeeping for Andrey as well. I mean, there must be some intimate knowledge of beekeeping, I think, to write a book like this. So that could be quite interesting.
Yeah.
Kane.
Yeah, I guess there's a sort of few questions I want to ask, and I might need a little bit of help formulating them into something good. So I really agree with Bill's point. I mean, I think it was a brilliant passage to pick up on around this it's sort of this quiet protest that sits through the entire novel. And I guess as part of that, it would be really good to understand, like, to what position is Sergei's character meant to be, a sort of an everyman. And I think sort of counter to that, this idea of, I'm just really interested in this sort of, this sense of identity that sits behind it, and how, because I think that's really forceful throughout, is people trying to maintain a kind of fixed idea of who they are within a world in which that is continuously challenged. I'm not sure how you asked that as a question.
I think it sounded like there was a question there to me. I think perhaps the local and Sergeyevich he seems to straddle both the local and the universal, maybe. I suppose the themes of loneliness, isolation, they certainly speak to our contemporary concerns in this COVID world we're living through, with social distancing and stay-at-home orders. I can see that feeling of isolation is something we've all had a sense of, isn't it? And so he seems to certainly represent something universal, I think, but also he's tied to a specific place. He's a product of that place. So I don't know, Ken. I don't know if that's helped you formulate your question. I probably haven't done any better either. Okay, and Bill.
Well, I'd like to ask Andrey about absurdity. I was reading an interview that he must have done 6 or 7 years ago in The Guardian, where the interviewer had asked him, got him to tell him the story of his self-publishing and how he had to go and rescue some of the 10,000 copies of the book that somebody had bought from him because they refused to pay. So the only means of transport available was a hearse. And they'd driven to this distributor and got the books back. But then Andrey had to spend the night in a hearse guarding his stock before he could find a different place to sell it. That's a story from his life that seems to me speaks to the kind of humor which is present in his book. And if you've read, I'm trying to remember his name now, but there was in the 70s there was a very successful book, a book of a fable, called something like The Private Life of Ivan Chomkin. And these simple, you get a novel which pretends it's a simple story, perhaps even a peasant story, you could say, which works because it's able to use that method to deal with something complex and difficult. And in the story of Chomkin, of course, he's meant to guard an Ally plane that's been downed in Russia, and he's basically in this village guarding the plane for most of the war. So there is this sense of the small life told almost as a fable. And I'd love Andrey to comment on that.
Fantastic. I think we have a good set of questions then. I think also I can see that in the chat, our audience are also invited to pose their questions as well. So hopefully we'll have a chance. Please do post away using the Ask a Question function. And shall I hand back to you now, Bill, to invite Andrey back to the discussion?
Yes, by all means. So, thank you, Emma, for bringing Andrey back. We just need his picture now. And here he is, right. So, Andrey, a very strange experience. We've been talking about your book as though you weren't there. This is we're doing in miniature what we usually take the best part of an hour to do, because a book club is a participatory thing, and we're trying to also make an event that's interesting for our audience, who have been very politely listening to us play the game of book club. So now it's your turn to talk about your book. Don't worry about the questions for now. Just tell us about your book, your writing, where it comes from, and perhaps even where you're going next with it.
Good evening once more. I think first of all, probably I should mention that I started writing at the age of 7 with poems. And I have a brother who is 7 years older than me. He was anti-Soviet, semi-activist in Soviet times. And his friends would come to our kitchen, small kitchen in Khrushchev-era apartment, and sit around table and drink port wine and exchange jokes, political jokes especially. And I was listening to these jokes. And so actually, I moved from poetry to joke inventing. And I wrote a lot of jokes that I heard afterwards, but I was never sure they were invented by me or by somebody else at the same time. And from jokes, I came to the prose, to short stories, and then to novels. So basically, I started with humor. And the humor in the Soviet time was very politically incorrect, very rough, and at the same time, among the anti-Soviet intellectuals, there was a cult of Daniil Harms, who remains my favorite sort of absurdist and black humor writer from the beginning of 20th century. So I wrote, I think, most of my books using this kind of black humor and elements of surrealism. And the Grey Bees is, I think, much less humorous and has natural surrealism, not invented by me, but actually sort of created by real life events. I was not going to write this book because, the war started in 2014 in Donbass. And after annexation of Crimea, that was actually March, that was 7 years ago already. And at that time, there were already people writing about the war. And I was asked by some journalists if I also write already something. And I said, no, I haven't written yet about Chernobyl disaster, because in 1986, when Chernobyl exploded, there were also writers writing fast novels and non-fiction books about Chernobyl disaster. And when I was asked then if I write something, I said that I will write maybe in 30 years when it is clear what happened and the consequences are more or less understandable. So I had the same attitude towards the events which were happening in 2014, 15, etc. But because of this war, Ukraine got 1.5 million internal refugees. So the people who went from Donbass to Ukraine proper, and 800,000 who went to Russia. And in Kyiv, where I live, suddenly we had a huge influx of quite expensive, very often cars with Donetsk or Lugansk number plates. And this is not only different culture and mentality, but it's also a different way of driving. So actually, this irritated lots of Kyivites, and we had another sort of wave of hate posts on Facebooks and photos of the cars which are misbehaving on the roads because they think they are much more important, the drivers, than the locals, etc. But somehow this stopped because those actually people who were misbehaving on the road from Donetsk, they were not refugees. They were people, the business people who bought, before moving to Kyiv, bought houses or flats as investments, and then they had to use them for themselves when the war started. And the ordinary refugees very often came without cars or in normal cars and were always driving political or not correctly. And also many of my friends suddenly had in their companies refugees from Donbass, young people, and I started meeting them quite often. And once actually one of the new acquaintances from Donetsk, a young businessman who opened a cafe, he told me that he is driving his car once a month practically to the border to the front line, to the gray zone, because there is a village in the gray zone where 7 families are still living, and they are trying to live the same way as they lived before. So they are cultivating land, they have plots, they grow potatoes and vegetables and making pickles. And he was buying pickles from them, bringing them what they needed, like medicines, because I mean, in the gray zone, you don't find shops, pharmacies, or police or anything, no establishments, no organizations. So people are left for themselves there. And I suppose he is still going there to visit them, and he brings these pickles and sells them through his cafe. And this conversation with him actually provoked my thoughts about gray zone in general, because the front line in Donetsk is 450 kilometers long, which means that the gray zone is also 450 kilometers long. And sometimes it is very narrow strip of land, sometimes it is quite wide, several kilometers. And I'm sure there are dozens of thousands of people living there. And in one place, actually, the gray zone is taken part of an industrial city, Avdiivka, for example. So the city is on the Ukrainian-controlled territory, but part of the city is gray zone and battle zone. And I mean, it is the industrial part, so I don't think any people are living there. But most of the villages in gray zones are not abandoned. There is somebody living there, and I wanted actually I decided to write the book when already about 200 books about the war were written, and most of them were written by participants from the Ukrainian side, volunteers and soldiers, and even a couple of writers went to the front. One was actually mobilized to the army, Artyom Chekh, and the other one went as a volunteer to fight. So we had already a huge bulk of books about war heroes, Ukrainian war heroes fighting the separatists. And there was not a single book about civil population or people who are living there, or people who actually are living on the territory controlled by separatists and Russia. So I decided to just to create these characters to show the typical Donbass mentality, because for many Ukrainian patriots, people who are in the gray zone or on the territories controlled by separatists, they're considered like enemies who accepted the enemy and they are loyal to them. In fact, actually, many thousands of refugees from Donbass who went to look for better life and safer life in Ukraine-controlled territories, they had to return because they were not helped financially by the state. They couldn't find jobs, they couldn't rent flats, so they went back, and they are still now in this part of Lugansk and Donetsk region, which is controlled by separatists and by Russian Federation. And of course, I mean, in Ukraine, everybody understands the difference in mentality between Donbass people and Crimean people and people from other regions. Of course, I mean, abroad, it is not so clear. But generally, I mean, just to give you a bit of information, people in Donbass was always industrial region with a huge percentage of working class people, miners and plant workers, factory workers. It was always controlled by local mafia. Kiev's political or criminal elite couldn't control Donbass. It was under the political and criminal control of their own people. And then actually the President Viktor Yanukovych, who is now in Moscow and who fled in 2014, he was the governor of Donbass, and he was funded by Donbass oligarchs practically, and promoted by them to become Ukrainian president, which he did in 2010 from the second attempt. And he subconsciously probably wanted to turn all territory of Ukraine in Donbass, meaning that actually people in Donbass are very loyal to their region. They are very obedient to the bosses, either mafia bosses or direct owners of the plants and factories. They always supported their regional party, and there were several regional parties. And the last one actually even was called Party of Regions. This was Viktor Yanukovych's party. So people were not interested in politics. They were voting for the politicians they were told to vote. They were doing what they were told to do. And there was a cult of Soviet life. There was purposely and artificially supported nostalgia, also supported and financed by Russian Federation, not only by locals. It is quite different from Crimea, where monarchic nostalgia was supported by Russian Federation and was sponsored. So, I mean, because of the palaces of different tsars, I mean, like natural souvenirs of Crimea were the albums, photo albums of Tsar families, etc. So even the poorest people in Crimea were monarchists, I would say, and are monarchists when you talk to them. And people in Donbass, ordinary people, they are very pro-Soviet, and they believe that Putin is trying to resurrect Soviet Union. That's why they are also pro-Russian. But actually, I mean, most of the population in Donbass is passive, very passive. And these are people who are used to live in their small world, and they had the lowest rate of internal and external migration. People never traveled, or almost never traveled. There were people who never left their region in all their life, unlike Ukrainians from Western Ukraine or from Kiev or from Central Ukraine or from Odessa region. So I think actually probably it gives you more information, the book, when you understand the mentality differences. But generally, the book was not accepted, I would say, universally positive in Ukraine, because there are no battles described, there are no macho characters, Ukrainian soldiers. So there were some kind of either neutral feedbacks or negative feedbacks, almost accusing me of promoting separatism and promoting image of separatists, which is not true, because I mean, you can see from the book that even the slightest sympathy in Donbass is also psychologically geopolitical. I mean, like if Pashka lived facing with his garden facing Ukrainian forces, maybe he would behave like Sergeyich, not like himself. And also, if you think about the refugees in Donbass, those who were living more close to the border, they went together with pro-Ukrainian refugees to Ukraine. And those who lived on the Russian border, more often they went to Russia. Of course, not the Ukrainian patriots, they would always go to Ukraine. But I traveled 3 times in the Donbass and Lugansk on Ukrainian side, approaching front lines and approaching Russian border. And it's true, the more close to Russia you went in 2015, the highest percentage of people would be anti-Kiev or anti-European. But it was also thanks to Russian TV propaganda and local politicians' propaganda, who were portraying Europeans as gay. And there were posters, I remember, in 2010, before the presidential elections, which were saying that if Ukraine joins European Union, everybody will have to become homosexual. I mean, I assume that somebody who never went to Ukraine and doesn't know anything about Ukraine would think that this is just a lie, this is just a fantasy, but it existed. And there are people actually who are, because of this propaganda, extremely aggressive towards European Union. Well, maybe that's enough for now.
No, that's terrific, Andrey, and it gives us much needed context. So, Sam, do you want to now run the Q&A?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Bill. I mean, thank you, Andrey, for that wonderful insight into contemporary Ukraine, contemporary Ukrainian politics, and of course the wider events there and in that region. I suppose this leads us on nicely to Kane's question, which is perhaps related to, I suppose, political engagement, could we say, in your text. But I'll let Kane pose his question because he'll do so better than I can summarize.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you talk about Sergey being sort of rooted within that Donbass mentality, and I sort of was interested on the other end to what extent Sergey in some ways has a sort of everyman side to him. That there's this, I really found it interesting, the sense of like that the grey zone, whilst he escapes and leaves the grey zone with his bees, that there's this sort of kind of malaise that sits over everything throughout his journey, and that there's these sort of very quiet forms of protest that he comes up against, and also about the sort of the naivety of his character, which I think again might be rooted in that sort of small world that he occupies before leaving. You know, particularly his knowledge, you know, his sort of growing knowledge of the Tatar population in Crimea. So yeah, I was just interested to what extent, is he a very specific character, but also is he sort of representative of something more universal?
Well, I think for me, he's a typical representative of Donbass. He was hardworking. He was not completely honest as everybody else. He was very attached, and he's very attached to his region, to his village. And in Donbass, actually, the region is their religion. So because there was a local patriotism created to support the ideas of local people, that they should vote only for local politicians, they should only for regional political forces, etc. So they created this kind of psychological nation, Donetsk people, in such a way that actually people in other regions were afraid, and they were thinking that actually all Donetsk people are bandits who can come and conquer their lands, who can actually just take away their businesses. And lots of stories connected with this notion were circulating all 30 years in Ukraine. So if somebody says that I'm from Donetsk, you were supposed to be afraid of him at once, because he is more rough, he is more bloody, he doesn't care about anything, and behind him there is a huge invisible force. This thing, even if you are a normal person from Donbass village, this is like some kind of very strange subconscious pride that the world should be afraid of us. We are important. The other thing is that it was put over the historical pride, industrial pride, which was created in the Soviet time. That there were slogans that be proud to be from Donbass, because Donbass is the most industrial region in the Soviet Union and brings the country lots of income and lots of coal and metal and everything else. And at the same time, if you are sort of taking pride in this, you feel yourself a tiny element of this system. So you're just alone, you mean nothing. You are like one bee from the beehive. You are precious to the country only if you are one of millions, together with other millions, working to create wealth for the country, or working to make this country more important in the world. So this this kind of I would say pride also requires that you are not intellectual, that you are not politically active. And in the Ukrainian, already after independence in the Ukrainian times, it was almost impossible for other political parties to open offices in Donbass region. Those parties who managed to open offices, they couldn't do anything. Very often they wouldn't be able to put big boards or billboards before the elections, because everything was controlled only by regional and local politicians and mafia, etc. And we see now, we have a new Forbes list of the most rich people in Ukraine. It is always number one, Rinat Akhmetov, non-Crimean but Tatar from Donbass, who was the owner of Donbass practically, and who created Viktor Yanukovych. So it's still, he left, the separatists took away his businesses. And in the beginning, he was actually supporting the separatist movement, but then he had to flee, and he remains the richest man in Ukraine. And he never said publicly any nasty or negative, semi-negative word about Putin, Russia, or Donbass separatists. He keeps quiet. He's just doing business. So. For me, it was an attempt to portray, not in a negative way, I would say in neutral way, typical Donbass mentality.
Andrey, given the political situation that you've just outlined, I'd just like to bring in a question from Kate Norman in our chat. or in the questions and answers section. So she's asked about how your position as an author, I suppose, with regard to this political situation, and how much you feel capable of saying in your works in terms of personal safety. How do you perhaps strike a balance with what you do? You feel the need to censor yourself maybe in the works you write?
No, I never censored myself. I had problems, but mostly not because of my books, but because of my interviews abroad and because of my articles. I had after one of the novels, I had like a series of negative feedbacks in the newspapers run by or owned by the oligarchs whom I dislike. But these were just negative, very negative reviews saying that my novels are bad, I'm a bad writer, and there is nothing interesting in what I write, and that's all. And also about Donbass, I don't think there is any danger actually to write now about Donbass, unless you write, of course, something positive about separatists and pro-Russian volunteers. But then you will get probably, if you are a Ukrainian citizen, a lot of hate and maybe physical assault. But I mean, we don't have this kind of books. These books are published in Russia and are written by separatists. I'm a Ukrainian patriot, but I didn't want to write another sort of heroic novel because I'm trying, maybe even subconsciously, to check that there is a balance, that we don't create enemy from somebody who is not an enemy. And this is very important. I mean, we have a lot of hatred, not only on Facebook in Ukraine, but very often on the street. And I mean, we should return human faces to humans. I mean, it doesn't mean that we should say something positive about bad people or criminals, but we shouldn't forget that actually people who are even on the territories of Donetsk and Lugansk controlled by separatists who are living there, if they live there, it doesn't mean that they are not Ukrainians or they are enemies of Ukrainian independence or etc. So my story is not really a story about the war. It is about the war, but more it is about humans, about people who live there, who have to live there because either they cannot leave the place because of their mentality, because their history, because they have nowhere to go, or because they are physically stopped from leaving the place. Also, it happens.
Fantastic, thank you. Lisa, would you like to ask your question? Now we're on the subject of the author himself.
Yeah, I guess why beekeeping? So beekeeping seems to be, as our main character travels around, he finds other beekeepers or finds somebody who can help him with beekeeping. So I'm interested in whether this might have been used as a way to show commonality, to show that there is a common currency. Honey is used as a common currency, you know, but there are other beekeepers as well. Is this something that happen? Do people keep bees in this part of the world? Is it common to find a beekeeper?
Well, yes, beekeeping is very popular in Ukraine. So in every village you will find several beekeepers. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that, I mean, you can find different nationalities around the world. I mean, like Welsh, Scottish, Ukrainians, Poles, and separately beekeepers, because it is also a nation. Psychologically, they are different. And actually, I think bees are making beekeepers nicer people. They like turn these people from potential evil, from becoming not so positive. I mean, because I mean they're giving example of ordinary and orderly life, productive life. And I myself actually went to Lithuania for lessons in beekeeping. I was in the several days in the east north of Lithuania near Anykščiai town to learn about beekeeping in order not to make stupid mistakes that will make real beekeepers who are also readers angry. But in fact, I mean, what I describe in the book, that you can lie on the beehives, etc., and it sort of helps you. It is true. It was much more popular in Yanukovych time, and he did use this soothing procedure, sleeping on the beehives. But it is a common thing in Ukraine.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrey. I suppose this leads us on to a question, now that you brought up the bee bed, which could be described perhaps as a humorous aspect, or at least maybe absurd part of the text. Bill, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I would. Andrey, I can see in your other books and in this the novel we're talking about now, Grey Bees, that there is a hinterland of Russian absurdism behind you, whether we're talking about Gogol rather more cruelly or Bulgakov in the 30s and 40s, 30s, I should say. And yet the tone of the book is gentle. So we don't get those sharp extremes you get in a Bulgakov or a Gogol. And I just wondered if you would comment on that, about whether that was a conscious thing. I mean, the interview I mentioned about your life contains some wonderfully absurd stories. So absurdity is, you could say, a common currency. And yet there is this literary tradition that I'm sure you're aware of too.
Well, yes. As I said, I love Soviet and Russian and Ukrainian traditions of black humor. And Gogol was from Ukraine, from Poltava region. Bulgakov was born and lived in Kiev until he went to Caucasus and then to Moscow. So it is from there. What I can say regarding me being not very aggressive towards things I'm laughing at, I think this is already sort of my nature, because my principle is to love all my characters, including the negative ones. Sort of try to understand the reasons and origins of their evil or thoughts and actions. So I'm never aggressive towards my characters, and also, I mean, practically, I cannot say that I don't know how to hate, and if you don't know how to hate, you cannot pass it on through the text. I mean, I'm trying always to understand the motives, the results of the actions of the characters, and actually, for me, the most important thing is to create the character and then to follow that he does everything logically according to his nature, to his motivations. And I mean, whereas as I said, I love Bulgakov and Gogol and Kafka also, but also I like Knut Hamsun, and I like the literature which is easily written while listening to depressive classical music, like Gustav Mahler or Schoenberg, sort of with psychological depths, with more layers of motivations and of psychology than you can see from the first glance.
Okay. While on the subject of humor, Andrey, I just thought I'd bring in Adrian French's question from the question section as well, about absurdist humor. So Adrian asks whether absurdist humor is a form of resistance or a way of coping with totalitarian oppression, or perhaps both at the same time, or maybe those two things are one and the same. Do you see absurdist humor as a form of resistance or a coping mechanism for oppression?
I think in the Soviet time it was both. I mean, but probably there is more coping with the situation in this than resisting the situation, sort of, because it's already, I mean, you laugh at the situation, which is absurd, when you accept that this is the reality, when you cannot resist it, when you are drawn into this situation. So it's like 70% of coping and 30% of resistance.
Thank you. That was a very precise answer, I have to say. Okay, and so on the subject of coping mechanisms and how the characters cope, I can see Joe Heinrich has also asked a question about how we're expected, I suppose, to read these characters, we might say. So Joe mentions that she's been doing some translations for an international charity offering humanitarian aid in the grey zone. And the statistics she's seen around mental health for villagers in the area are shocking. How sane do you think the main character and Pashka are?
They're completely sane because they are normal for their environment. I mean, the norm is what is supported by the majority of people who live in one place. So what we see sometimes as abnormality is complete normality, and from their point of view, we are abnormal. So, I mean, the characters of Pashka and Sergeyich are typical for the whole region. So this is the norm of the region. What would be untypical for this region is to be politically active, to be, I don't know, disagreeing with the system, with the situation, and to be trying to resist the situation. What is typical is to survive and to do everything possible not to be noticed, not to attract attention. The easiest way not to attract attention, not to leave your territory, not to leave your courtyard. This is norm.
Okay, thank you. So a comment I see repeated in the questions is an idea, I suppose, of the main character and certainly the neighbor as being in some way wrapped up with their existence, this day-to-day process of living. Obviously, their basic needs, to meet their basic needs, requires a lot of work because of the circumstances, because of the particular place that they're living in. I'm also wondering whether this characters that are wrapped up in themselves, this sense of isolation, I think, that you have in the novel, a sense of isolation, but also a sense of community, I suppose. The characters are often reach out to other characters, don't they? So they're happy by themselves, they're happy within themselves, living this interior life, but they also need that community as well. And I'm also wondering about this. There's a, I mean, I think it's a theme that you develop, but it's in one part of the text specifically, I think you mention it explicitly, and this idea of isolation as a way of understanding the self. So the relationship between isolation and understanding the self. And I'm just wondering, is that a theme that's close to your heart? I mean, do you see that as being a theme in this text? What kind of role has isolation played, perhaps? I don't know, obviously it's playing a big role in lots of people's lives at the moment. Has it played a role in your life? Do you see isolation as being important maybe to the role of a writer, for instance?
Well, when you write a book, you are always isolated. I mean, you look for isolation. So I mean, it's normal way of life for a person who writes. In the novel, it is not a specific theme, but I would say this is a hint on Orthodox religious tradition, because the monks that wanted to become more enlightened, they would leave the monastery and go to settle in cave alone. And there was a special word. There is a special word in Russian, zatvorniki, people who lock themselves in. And they didn't talk ever to anybody else. The food was brought to them, and then they would pick it up. So I mean, Pashka and Sergeyich, they are involuntary zatvorniki, sort of monks. And of course, I mean, if you are alone and you don't have anybody to talk to, you start talking to the world and to yourself. So you are becoming more enlightened because you have more motivation to think about everything. So I mean, you can develop probably this idea to the level that Pashka and Sergej are, I'd say, becoming more wise, or with the time that they spend, only two of them in the village, because they have to concentrate on themselves and on one another. It's almost like religious practice.
They do seem to resist emotional attachment as well. So Sergej, I mean, he has the opportunity, doesn't he, to stay when he's on his travels. He meets a woman and has a relationship with her over that short period of time, and he has the opportunity to stay with her, doesn't he? I mean, that's kind of perhaps an ending of the novel that maybe is that presented as a possibility for Sergej, or is he always going to be drawn back to the gray zone, I think?
Well, I mean, he thought he will feel okay in this village near Vesele, where he meets Gala, the shop assistant. But I mean, he was made to understand that he is a stranger there. And he is not a stranger only in the place he belongs to. And strangely enough, I mean, at the same time, when he is going back, in his mind, he is going back to safety of his house, his own territory, the place he understands and the place that understands him. So, I mean, the safety gets another meaning, the word safety in this sense. Because there he can be killed accidentally, but not because he doesn't belong to the place, because he is a stranger.
Okay. Speaking of death, perhaps now would be a good occasion to bring Penny Holt's question in from the question section. She remarks on death as a feature of a few of your books, and she remarks on the fact there are a couple of funerals in this novel. She asked if this is a thing of yours.
Maybe it is a thing of mine which I'm trying to stop and not to let infiltrate all of my novels or all of my texts. My first short story was about funeral of my grandmother. And the funeral actually happened when I was 6 years old, and the story I wrote when I was 15 or 14. And when I was impressed, I mean, I still remember this is the most sort of visual picture from my childhood. I don't want to describe this funeral, but my grandmother, I mean, she was a doctor. She was a front line surgeon in the wartime, and then she was the head doctor and surgeon of the train hospital on the front line in Second World War. And when she came back, she became head doctor of the children's sanatorium in suburb of Kiev, Pushcha-Voditsa, for kids with tuberculosis. And she was local deputy. She was a proper Communist Party member. And when she died, actually, the whole suburb was following a truck with her coffin laid on top of the truck, on top of the carpet, towards the cemetery. And the whole family gathered, and then there were probably a couple of thousand of people walking behind. So this is the only sort of funeral probably that remained in my head after childhood, and maybe this is the reason of my thoughts and other, or this death is sometimes seems like a thing, my thing.
Okay.
But I should say also, I mean, why do I have so many animals in my books? Because all my pets in childhood died tragically, mostly because of my neglect. So I'm quite a guilty person in this sense.
Your main character feels this tremendous sense of responsibility for his bees, doesn't he?
Yeah.
perhaps that's also a reflection of that same neglect that you subjected those animals to in your when you were a child.
Probably yes, but I'm tired to analyze myself. I know my guilt.
Okay, so I can see that there are a couple more questions. So Chris Hayes has a question about Sergei's. I suppose the question really comes. I mean, it's not phrased exactly as a question, but I'll see if I can formulate this into a question. So I think the question is about Sergei's knowledge. What would his political knowledge be like of events outside of where he's living? What would his knowledge, for example, of Crimea be before he travels there? Would he have some kind of knowledge before then, or is this something that he discovers when he gets there and that surprises him?
I mean, he didn't know obviously anything about Crimean Tatars story. So he wouldn't know maybe even about deportation of Crimean Tatars by Stalin in the end of the Second World War. And yeah, I mean, this travel would be a travel of discovery for him because he, I mean, in the imagination of people who never think about, for example, Crimea is like Soviet or post-Soviet Mediterranean place with beautiful palaces and nice beaches, etc. So I mean, it's not populated. It is created by the Soviet Union for the holiday makers who are supposed to be proletariat and important Soviet people. So I mean, this like legend still exists, because I mean, even I know the name of the first Soviet commissar responsible for health holidays of the Soviet proletariat, Semashko. So I mean, it's a land of sanatoriums and hotels and spa centers.
Okay. And then we do have one final question in the Q&A section. So Phil Olson mentions that he read and loved Death and the Penguin as part of a book club, and he has a question about publishing and about self-publishing in your own work as a writer. So he asks if your route into working as a novelist when you successfully self-publish your books, whether that was a necessary route or was that something that perhaps gave you freedom? Was it something that you chose, perhaps?
Well, what happened actually after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the publishing houses ceased to exist. Before that, we had only state publishing houses with the censorship and with different principles. And then we had small independent, which would sell only commercial books and print. And in 1992, I was, at that time, actually, some poets in Ukraine, in Kiev, started doing self-publishing, printing, sometimes on typewriter, 100 copies of small collections of their poems. And somebody asked me if I not going to publish myself also. And I was writing children's books and novels. So I decided to try, but on different level. And I borrowed $16,000 from two of my friends who were business people. I bought 6 tons of paper in Kazakhstan. And there were people who helped me to transport this paper from Kazakhstan to Kiev free of charge. This was still possible. And then actually I published 75,000 copies, 50,000 copies of book for children, Adventures of Baby Vacuum Cleaner Gosha, and 25,000 copies of Big First Fuse. And I had to sell them myself. So I mean, I tried to distribute them all around Ukraine and also to Russia. And when I had time, I also was selling them with signatures on Andreevsky Spusk. That's the street in Kiev, the most famous street where Bulgakov lived, where you can buy souvenirs matryoshkas, samovars, and paintings, etc. And so when I first time came there with 2 bags of books, I made myself a card, sort of poster. I am the author, and I was standing on the street between 2 matryoshka traders, and a guy came up to me, almost 2 meters, 6 feet, 7 feet, almost high, tall, and he said, "I'm from Protection Racket. What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm selling my books." And he said, "What do you mean your books?" I said, "I wrote them, I printed them, and I'm selling them." And he said, "Okay, you can do it when if you have problems, tell me. I'm here every day at noon." And I said, "Would you like to have a book with an autogram?" And he said, "No, thank you, I don't read." And he left. And so I had this gratis Protection Racket protection. But I had lots of different experiences. And I mean, this experience made me much stronger in a way, because I had to survive lots of very difficult situations during the publication process and then during the attempts to sell. And I managed to sell, and I even earned $700 with which I bought my first computer.
Okay. I think, inspired by your wonderful anecdotes about your life, Stevens asked a question, which is that if you have an intention to write your memoir.
I don't have an intention. I mean, I keep diaries from the age of 15, sometimes sort of daily notes, sometimes once a month. There are lots of things actually which are very Romanesque in my life, but I just don't know. I don't feel like writing it. Maybe it's too early.
Maybe we should ask you again in a number of decades, Andrey. It's perhaps something that's done towards the end of one's life rather than mid-career.
I can actually tell you one thing. I was persuaded by my Indian publisher to write memoirs about my childhood, and you can find actually, because I mean they are published in Malayalam language of Kerala, but also in English on Matrubhumi newspaper English site. So you can try to find there are 10 or 11 big chapters about my Soviet childhood, including about my grandparents and parents and my brother and my school.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we've come to the end of our Q&A session. I'm just wondering, Bill, if there's any questions you've seen perhaps in the main chat that I've missed, or if there is anything that we should add at this point.
I think you've covered the ground pretty well, because happily people who ask questions in the chat then moved their questions into the ask a question. You were picking those up. So I'm very happy to say that I'm sorry that this is coming to an end, but I'm delighted that it's because we've run out of time, not for any other reason. So it's just for me to say, Andrey, thank you so much for being so generous with your time when you've only just settled in America and got your house in order and are beginning to have a life there. So thank you for sparing the time to come and talk to us. Thank you for the fullness and generosity of your answers. And I think all of us who haven't read any of this new book will immediately go out and buy it, and also discover your backlist. Now, you can buy Andrey's novel, Grey Bees, from the Litfest online bookshop, and know that every purchase also helps us to fund future events and projects. But before we all go our separate ways, I'd just like to say this. You'll see a little green button at the bottom of the screen called Click to Donate. Before we all go our separate ways, if you enjoyed today's event, don't forget to click on the donate button on your screen or go to our website. Every penny will go towards creating exciting future projects and events and strengthening Litfest as an independent arts charity. So this is where we actually say goodbye. I'm sorry, Andrey, we cannot invite you back to the green room for a vodka or a glass of wine. So we have to say our goodbyes now. But thank you all, especially to our audience, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, on behalf of everyone, to Andrey Kurkov. And there would be a loud round of applause, I think.
Thank you very much.
If you were in a proper auditorium. And I hope we'll see you all soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.